There's this old adage of if the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the facts. And if they're both against you, you scream like hell. But the fact of the matter is that the law and the facts are with us, and it's the other side that has been screaming like hell, because they do not have that. They are only able to advance their position through stirring up racial hatred, through invoking ancient blood libels. It used to be that Jews were accused of killing Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual. Now it's Jews are accused of targeting Palestinian children or starving Palestinian children. This is as false as the ancient blood libels, but they are as widely believed today, perhaps, as the ancient blood libels were in their time. And all of these legal terms, like occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and genocide, these are the modern blood libel. Now, we have the tools to push back on all of these. And I do believe that it is, a great sense of purpose and a real mission, especially for readers of the Allgemeine, who are better informed than the vast majority of people out there, to take it upon themselves to pick up that mantle and to push back on these falsehoods.
Welcome back to the J100 podcast. I'm David M. Cohen. Before we begin, I want to share one brief note. This conversation was recorded some time ago, before several of the most recent developments in international law, diplomacy, and the broader information war now shaping Israel's place in the world. And precisely because of what has unfolded in recent weeks, the controversies surrounding the ICC and the ICJ, the intensifying Lawfare campaign against Israeli leadership, and even the surreal political promises here in the United States to arrest the Prime Minister of Israel should he set foot in New York, we felt that now was the right moment to release this episode. Because the themes we discussed today aren't just timely, they've become urgent. My guest is the indomitable Natasha Hausdorff, a London-based barrister whose clarity on international law and moral courage in the public arena have made her one of the most compelling defenders of Israel on the global stage. Long before these latest headlines, before the ICC's controversial warrants, before the ICJ's rulings were publicly distorted, before local politicians in the West began using international law as a rhetorical weapon, Natasha was sounding the alarm. She has been explaining with rare precision how international law is being inverted, manipulated, and weaponized to attack the Jewish state. In our conversation, recorded prior to this latest wave of legal and political escalation, Natasha walks us through the mechanics of lawfare, how false legal narratives gain traction, how media infrastructures repeat them, and how Western institutions, sometimes knowingly and sometimes out of ignorance, amplify them. She explains how terms like genocide, apartheid, and occupation have become modern blood libels, detached from their legal meanings, but deployed with extraordinary force. She lays out why understanding the ICC, the ICJ, and the UN structural biases is no longer optional. It's part of the battlefield. Listening back, I was struck by how prophetic Natasha's insights now sound. The misreporting, the weaponizing of legal terminology, the political theater dressed up as jurisprudence, the rapid export of anti-Semitic narratives into mainstream discourse. She saw all of it coming, not because she's a fortune teller, but because she understands the architecture of these institutions and how vulnerable they are to abuse. This episode is not just an analysis, it is a call to literacy, a call to clarity, a call to courage. At a moment when Israel's legal, diplomatic, and moral standing is under relentless attack, when international law is being bent beyond recognition for political ends, and when even Western leaders play recklessly with language they do not understand, Natasha Hausdorff provides something rare, an anchor, someone who knows the law, someone who respects the law, someone who refuses to allow it to be turned into an instrument of disinformation. So although this conversation was recorded earlier, its relevance has only intensified, and perhaps in ways none of us could have anticipated at the time. I hope you'll find this episode as clarifying, grounding, and galvanizing as I did. Here is my conversation with Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha, thank you so much for making the time and for being here.
David, it's my pleasure. Thank you. I've been a fan of the Allgemeine for many, many years, and I've certainly been to one of your galas when I was living in New York.
Oh, wow.
I think that was 2018. I was so impressed by the level of support that you were able to corral into a very beautiful ballroom. So it was a great honor to be included in your very prestigious list.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that shout out. We really appreciate it. So, tell our audience a little bit, just in terms of who you are in your own words, kind of where you grew up, what your ambitions were as a young lady. I'd love to hear a little bit.
Well, I grew up in London, born and bred, but
I hear that. I hear that a little bit. Yeah.
can't lose the accent, but certainly with I'd say a strong sense of Israeli identity. My family go back there some 8 generations, and that was at the core of my realization when I went to a very nice secondary school in London, which I was extremely privileged to attend. It gave me a great deal in terms of, academic opportunities. But it also carried with it this received wisdom of the intellectual elite, which was extremely anti-Israel. So when I landed there, coupled with, my background in knowing the Israel that exists in reality, that coupled with the received wisdom that I was hearing from teachers as well as students, led me to understand that there was a lot of work to do in getting smart in learning the subject and in being prepared to stand up to the false information. That was probably some 25 years ago. So I've been doing this a little while. And my love of debating, really, which I'd say started even earlier than that, is definitely at the core of my seeking out a great deal of the arguments and debates around Israel and the Middle East, politics, although I spent quite a lot of my time at school and university debating a whole array of topics which had nothing to do with Israel. But that continued as I went to university and as I studied law at Oxford, including public international law, where I had an additional realization that it was, in fact, international law that was being used as the tool, was being weaponized in order to seek to discredit Israel. Many have referred to that as the modern form of anti-Semitism, attacking the Jewish state. But I saw international law was being inverted, abused, and misrepresented in order to do so. And while I started my career at Skadden Arps, which is a US law firm, and I was there during Tzuk Eitan, one's quite limited in being able to speak out at a large firm. And I'm extremely privileged now to be a barrister, an independent practitioner in London, and to have a greater degree of flexibility and ability to, as far as I'm concerned, stand up for the rule of law. It's not just pushing back against falsehoods about Israel. For me, it is standing up for the proper application of international law and the rule of law, international rule of law, and holding people to account who are spreading misinformation about that.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious, just to go back a little bit, when you were in your younger years. Did you have other classmates that you engaged in conversation that also kind of felt like, hey, this is not resonating, doesn't make sense about Israel? Or were you kind of like a loner in that primary school that you mentioned? It was a big treat to go there, and then you kind of learned what the party lines were. What was kind of like, what was the dialogue kind of outside the classroom or even within the other students? Did you find that other people it wasn't resonating with, or it was resonating with? I'm curious.
So this is secondary school, high school, that this change really took place. And unfortunately, I was the only one. I didn't grow up in the Jewish community in London at all. So until I went to university, I really thought there were 3 other Zionists in the whole of the UK, my parents and my sister. I'm delighted to discover that I was wrong on that count. But amongst the 700 girls at the school, I really was the only one. And I started to feel relatively comfortable in that role. I felt that I had even more of a duty to stand up and to push back against the misrepresentations because no one else was doing it. And that wasn't necessarily because, everyone had subscribed to the kind of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist agenda, but it was simply because of ignorance. And those girls who did take an interest in this subject were necessarily being misinformed by a media that has for decades now displayed a complete abject absence of journalistic integrity in covering the conflict, and has for at least the last year and a half, but unfortunately long before that, been parroting Hamas propaganda and the propaganda of other terrorist proxies of Iran. So it's perhaps less of a surprise that even back then and in my career at school, the 2006 Lebanon war was a real point of conflict, and I do remember many arguments, both with teachers and classmates, where the unfortunate reality was they didn't know what they were talking about. And I had the great advantage of insight to Israel, to Israeli media, and to a certain extent the falsehoods that were being parroted here on the media, even some 20 years ago.
If I understood you correctly, it strikes me that I think what you're saying is that even at a young age, like a lot of your contemporaries, it's not that they were anti-Semitic per se. They just were ill-informed or not informed, and they were very open to kind of hearing the rhetoric that is parroted, like you said, by the fake media, by the fake news, by the pro-Hamas, arms in the media, so on and so forth. It's not that they come in educated that way from their homes, or no, maybe it is that way. My understanding was more they're just kind of like naive. They just don't know, and then like it's just kind of thrust upon them, and they accept that as truth. That's accurate, you would say?
Absolutely, to an extent. So if you are, a reasonable individual and you consider yourself to be a good moral person, and you are consistently being told day after day that Israel is persecuting the Palestinians and denying human rights and generally acting as a despotic entity or a pariah state, then it's perhaps not so surprising that is what you consume in terms of media content, and that is what you believe. So they would have been the first to say, "Oh, of course, we're not anti-Semitic." That, of course, is not the case across every school in the UK. I taught at a school in 2008, a school called Bethnal Green Technology College at the time, where I was tasked by a charity debate mate to set up a debating program with the gifted and talented cohort that the school produced. And I'm sorry to say that I was hearing comments from some of the students along the lines of McDonald's pays the Jews to kill all the Arabs. That to me was anti-Semitic content, and it was coming clearly from home, from a handful of individuals perhaps, but unchecked, it was clear to me that the rest of the class would be going back believing that sort of sentiment. And when I challenged this and raised it with my contact teacher at the time, who was teaching English, she confirmed that this was a serious problem. She said she was unable to study set texts with these students for GCSE. That included The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is the Holocaust from a child's perspective. And she said it was impossible to read this text with her class because they would come out with things like, "If only Hitler were here today, he'd sort out the Jews once and for all." Now, I wrote that summer about my experiences at that school in 2008. I was working with Douglas Murray at the time at the Centre for Social Cohesion. And that school became famous, I think, about 5 years later. It changed its name to Bethnal Green Technology College, but this is the school that those three girls left in order to join ISIS.
Wow.
And I have to say, some 5 years later, I was not surprised. It's important to recognize, and this is a phenomenon that I'm sure is not limited to certain schools in central London. There is a serious problem of the sort of incitement and in this case, unquestionably anti-Semitic sentiment that has been allowed to fester and radicalize many in ordinary schools throughout the United Kingdom.
How do we move the needle like on this type of dynamic, right? Like we have thousands of listeners. Not all of them are barristers or lawyers or trained in these disciplines. What is the message for a regular person, whether it's a non-Jewish person, a Jewish person who is deeply disturbed by what you're sharing? What would you tell them? How would you encourage them to fight this fight, like to try to stem the tide?
I do think that we all have it within our power to push back on these falsehoods, and be they the false facts, supposed facts, or the false interpretations of international law. I think certainly my focus is on the law, and I think one of the reasons that so many falsehoods and inversions of international law have been allowed to become so pervasive is that the general literacy on international law is not great. And so many people do not feel equipped to push back on those falsehoods. And one of my missions, especially in the last few years, is to try and address that, to try and provide that basic knowledge, that ammunition, and to a certain extent, David, that confidence, because many people will know in their kishkas that what Israel is doing here is moral, is just, is right, and is on the right side of that law. But absent the sort of basic understanding of the frameworks at play, it can be very easy to give up on those individual battles. And I think that they are phenomenally important, whether they are conducted on social media, through letters to newspapers, through engagement with politicians, through holding people to account. I think it is incumbent on all of us. And I'm the first to admit that numbers are not necessarily on our side. There are many millions, if not billions, around the world that would like to see the state of Israel eradicated.
Right. And not only the numbers, the dollars, right? What Qatar and others are pouring into Al Jazeera and other similar media outlets, it's astounding. The numbers are astounding. We're fighting a real uphill battle. It's really, it's disconcerting to say the least.
To be true, absolutely. But I certainly believe in quality over quantity. And we have the added benefit of having truth on our side, and where the facts and the law are with you. There's this old adage of if the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the facts. And if they're both against you, you scream like hell. But the fact of the matter is that the law and the facts are with us, and it's the other side that has been screaming like hell, because they do not have that. They are only able to advance their position through stirring up racial hatred, through invoking ancient blood libels. It used to be that Jews were accused of killing Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual. Now it's Jews are accused of targeting Palestinian children or starving Palestinian children. This is as false as the ancient blood libels, but they are as widely believed today, perhaps, as the ancient blood libels were in their time. And all of these legal terms, like occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and genocide, these are the modern blood libel. Now, we have the tools to push back on all of these. And I do believe that it is, a great sense of purpose and a real mission, especially for readers of the Allgemeine, who are better informed than the vast majority of people out there, to take it upon themselves to pick up that mantle and to push back on these falsehoods, and to really view this as part of that mission. And in some respects, their Miluim, their reserve duty. So many of Israel's soldiers have been fighting in Gaza, in Lebanon, in areas in the West Bank. And that is not a defense of the Jewish people that everyone is able to take on, but there is definitely something that every single individual can contribute in their own way, with their own strengths, their abilities. And it's just finding the right niche and the right way to contribute. And I think this is, so important, because it is not just Israel's fight. This is a civilizational war. These are negative actors that are coming after our way of life in the West. The Western civilization and Western liberal values is essentially at stake here. And that requires everyone to, as I say, pick up the mantle and do what they can.
That was an amazing answer. Thank you so much. I was actually in DC, in Washington, DC. Sadly, we're having this conversation the morning after terrible anti-Semitic act was committed against two members, mixed reports, but it's certainly two people who work for the embassy in Washington, for Israel, etc., or were connected, obviously, in some way at an AGC event. And I actually had a few interactions with Congressman Randy Fine, who's actually a brand new congressman from Florida, very, very powerful advocate for the Jewish people, very articulate. He's going places, in my humble opinion, very smart individual. And he actually made this exact point in different formulation, but he basically said that, part of the challenge really is just that Israel is this tiny little state, and the United States is like this massive state. It's not a state, but this massive country, right? And state, I guess it is a state, right? And and Israel is not only tiny, but it's right next to all these Muslim Arab countries. The United States is far away. But his point was just that if the United States was where Israel is, and it was a little smaller, there was nothing stopping them from it. Because again, it's a battle against the West. It's not just a battle against the Jewish people. It's much larger than that. And the more that we can get broader society to appreciate that it's not the right. Douglas Murray always says, right? They start with the Jews, but then they come for everybody else. So you said it, in in a more forceful way even than I'm sharing it. But I think that's absolutely right. I'm a retired attorney, so I'm very, very intrigued by this conversation, and I have a lot of questions I want to ask. I don't even know where to go, but I'll start with this.
So if I could just add my own thoughts, just waking up to that news this morning was utterly devastating. I had the great pleasure of meeting Yaron some months ago when I spoke at the embassy in DC, and the price that he and Sarah have paid as a result of the sort of inflammatory false accusations that we have heard most recently from the United Kingdom, from France, and from Canada in that deplorable, appalling statement, which was celebrated by Hamas. I see that as inextricably linked with what happened yesterday. The blood libels that we've already talked about, and the fact that they are now entering the acceptable parlance and the rhetoric of states that previously presented themselves as allies of the state of Israel is deplorable. And I would just want to add my deepest condolences to Sarah and Yaron's family and friends and colleagues at the embassy. It's an unspeakable tragedy. And
as we say in Hebrew, ein milim, there are no words really to even express how harrowing and how tragic and how sad, just how very sad. And for the individual to basically, I saw a video this morning, to commit murder, cold-blooded murder, and then say free Palestine. What, like Maha Kesher? What's the connection? Like what? Like it's so.
We know very clearly that this is a death cult that has been able to inculcate itself within so much of the institutions of the West. Through the academy, through some of the civil service, even the police force here, in terms of the way that we've seen some police officers failing to police marches week after week on the streets of London calling for genocide against the Jews, and some of these metropolitan police officers indicating their agreement with these protesters. I mean, it's not surprising, as deeply tragic and lamentable, and it should never have happened, but it is unfortunately a direct consequence of where we have been seeing the rhetoric, the blood libel, the falsehoods against Israel, and the way that this has become an acceptable means of communicating in political and other discussions.
You're reminding me, my wife and I, we were in London about 2 weeks after October 7th for a wedding. It was in a hotel. I don't remember exactly where, somewhere, not far from central London. And there was the hotel was packed with refugees. And there was this Jewish wedding going on in the back of the hotel. And apparently there was a fight broke out between the groups the previous week. And they were the authorities were cordoning off the hotel. It was frightening. We didn't stay in central London because we were literally panicked and afraid. I mean, this is not society. This is not the way the democratic society should look, right? It's just how they say that the inmates are running the asylum type of thing, right? You see that, and I think you're articulating that and expressing it as well. And there has to be change, and it has to be called out. And like you said, when Hamas is giving you an approbation, when you're supposed to be kind of respected governments, and Hamas is patting you on the back, there's something extraordinarily problematic about that. That speaks louder than anything else. I'm saying? It's just it's obvious. So it's really it's complicated, to say the least. So I was going to ask you October 7th, and I want to hear a lot about kind of where you were and what your thinking was immediately. But, we're talking so much about the media wars, and we all have a role to play. You see basically that part of the attack was also in the media, meaning it wasn't just a planned attack against Israel physically. It seems that there were different machinations and different things in play, set up on campuses to be launched along with the attack. There's evidence to these types of things. What's your sense of kind of how well developed those strategies were, and how surprised or not surprised were you by that kind of information coming out?
I think that there should for sure be further investigation into, as you say, some of those initiatives, especially in the United States, that appear to have been planned in advance with prior knowledge of the 7th of October. But in terms of the media's take on this, I think the first interview I did was on the 8th of October. It was on Sky News, and I said, remember this moment, because at that moment, Israel hadn't begun really its proper operation. It was still dealing with terrorists in communities in the south of Israel. I said, remember this moment, because this is going to change. Very soon you will be pointing the finger at Israel, and that will not be an accurate reflection of what has occurred. And the sentiment that you are expressing now will be a distant memory. And frankly, I thought maybe it would be, a few months, maybe weeks, and it was ultimately a matter of days before the media started turning on Israel, and the same blood libels started being repeated. I mean, I remember the night of the Al Ahly hospital strike, which was the 17th of October, just 10 days later. And immediately I was supposed to be on the BBC at that very moment, in fact. And I had a call from the deputy editor of the channel, apologizing, saying, so sorry, we have to bump you for the rolling coverage of this breaking news. And I attempted to reason with him, because they were reporting this as an Israeli airstrike. And already, and this was only, I think, within an hour of the story breaking, I was already looking at reports online that indicated this was most likely a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that had fallen short, which is, of course, what was ultimately proven to be the case. But they would not listen. They were running this story on the basis of no information. Let me be clear. The BBC, who had people on the ground, admittedly, stringers that are not able to report anything without Hamas's approval, but still people on the ground, and they didn't even think to send someone down the street to take a look at the hospital and realize that it was intact, that in fact this PIJ rocket had fallen in the car park, and the 500 casualties that Hamas were claiming within minutes of this strike that had been caused were simply fabricated. That 500 figure has remained. I'm not sure if it's even been revised now. Remain part of the ultimate death toll, which tells you how reliable those figures from the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health can be. But this is just an indication of how very quickly the media started acting simply as a mouthpiece for Hamas propaganda. And a significant reason for that is that nothing is reported out of the Gaza Strip that is not endorsed and approved by Hamas and forms part of their narrative, the narrative of an internationally prescribed terrorist organization. So, in a sense, that aspect of the media coverage didn't even need to be planned, because it has been decades in the making. Matty Friedman wrote a series of wonderful essays over 10 years ago now, I think.
I just actually spent some time with Mati here in New York at the AJC conference. He's wonderful. Yeah, he's great.
He's great. And he articulated so clearly through his experience of working with the Associated Press in the Jerusalem bureau, what the editorial lines were, what the kind of unspoken rules of what could be written and what couldn't be written were. And of course, so many of the stories bear absolutely no connection to the realities on the ground. It is the story that the editors want to put out because it is the story that they believe sells. And that is unfortunately nothing new. Douglas Murray, who I mentioned earlier, and we did work together 15 years ago, shared with me that when he was embedded with the IDF in Lebanon, journalistic colleagues of his were very open about the fact that they had to be very careful about what they reported because of their colleagues in Beirut and what Hezbollah would do to them if these journalists reported the wrong thing while they were embedded with the IDF. So the notion that there is, in any sense, a free press in relation to the enemies of Israel, which of course the flip side of this is that not only is the press within Israel as free as one can possibly imagine, but the internal criticism and the internal debate is such that I do not think it can compare to any other country in terms of the robustness of the disagreements. But of course, all of that is ultimately used against Israel in the international arena. It's not seen as a positive at all. In fact, the international media cherry picks what is said, cherry picks the sorts of individuals that it will put on as voices from Israel, and invariably they will be ones that are at the very least, critical of Israel's approach, but in many, and I would say most cases, utterly misrepresentative of what is going on the ground.
You have a sense today, like where it seems, right, that Israel has a much stronger foothold in Gaza. Is it still the same today in terms of reporting out of Gaza? Has anything changed in terms of fear of Hamas or ability to, that the people there may not be inclined to tell the truth, but I'm just curious, is it the same like feeling even today at this later juncture in the war as it was earlier? Has there been any shift in terms of the ability for reporters to kind of, if they care to be accurate, to the freedom to be a little bit more accurate, or not?
I don't believe that there has been any shift, and I think it's important that we're clear that up until now, Israel has been very careful, excuse me, not to take control of any areas in the Gaza Strip. For a number of reasons, I'm sure militarily, operationally, a number of reasons, but also it would change Israel's responsibilities to the civilian population on the ground in terms of the application of international law if it were to either occupy or establish effective control over areas within the Gaza Strip. But in any event, though, the reporting that comes out is ultimately what the international media want to portray. So I remember seeing on Israeli news, Ohad Chemo, an Israeli journalist, was in Gaza and was interviewing Palestinians that were leaving, I believe it was Jabalia at the time, this was in November last year. And he had them on record, their faces were blurred for their own safety and protection, being very frank about the fact that Hamas was the cause of their troubles, that they in fact thanked Israel and the moral approach that Israel had taken, and the fact that Israel gave them humanitarian assistance and Hamas was killing them and shooting them, and had brought down this destruction on their heads. I did not see those reports anywhere in the international media. It doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't fit the agenda that is palpable in what it is that they have been reporting, including in these false allegations of starvation in Gaza. That we've had this allegation of 14,000 babies dying of starvation in 48 hours if they're not reached, which was reported in an enormous array of outlets before it was walked back for being, quite frankly, unbelievably ridiculous. But we've also seen photos and video images of allegedly starving children, starving because they didn't have access to food, next to incredibly well-fed mothers. Within the same shot. I have never encountered a mother who would eat before her starving child. Right. And the fact that these canards, these falsehoods, these have repeatedly been demonstrated to be very sick children who could not intake food, who were malnourished for reasons other than the availability of food, who were malnourished because of their very serious medical conditions, that have been beamed across the world as supposed evidence of this blood libel that Israel is starving children. And not one individual seemed to question why it is that the mother that was sitting next to the bedside of this child did not look in any way malnourished. That is not reasonable to me. That is not demonstrative of any sense of journalistic integrity. And frankly, that is taking the international public for fools. And it is deplorable to me that the international community seems to be falling for it. I mean, what that says about the level of intelligence generally is one thing. But to see, if I talk about the United Kingdom for a moment, to see David Lammy embracing this ridiculousness, to see even the Prime Minister Keir Starmer doing so is deeply, deeply troubling. And I think it raises a great number of questions, about not just the media, but the willingness of people to believe, despite the clear evidence to the contrary, that the Jews are starving children.
Right. Unfortunately, it's not hard to believe. Unfortunately, knowing the history of the hatred of the Jewish people and anti-Semitism. But thank you for articulating that so clearly. I'm curious if we can pivot a little bit to the international forums of law, if we'll call them that, ICC and other institutions. I know that you've played prominent roles in those forums. What has surprised you the most from your acting in those contexts or in those forums? What is most shocking to you or most surprising to you in the role that you've played in terms of what you've seen in those contexts?
It's a very good question, because I don't believe after, I'd say, 10 years of engaging and the kind of the international legal debate that much would surprise or shock me anymore. But I'll tell you, I'll give you one example. In January 2024, the International Court of Justice issued its first provisional measures order in the case that South Africa has brought alleging genocide. Now, you and I, and I'm sure many of your viewers will understand and intuitively that this is an allegation that is beyond ridiculous. And if it wasn't so serious, it would be laughable. And in fact, immediately after that first provisional measures order was made, I was on SABC, which is the South African version of the BBC, and my counterpart was celebrating, isn't it marvelous? Now we can finally use Israel and genocide in the same sentence, and nobody can tell us otherwise. That was, as I see it, the motivation of South Africa to bring this case, to shift the acceptable debate and the Overton window, if you will, on what it was acceptable to say about Israel. But the allegation of genocide in and of itself is nothing new. You know, I did a debate on the radio in 2014 during Tzuk Eitan, when my counterpart was alleging that Israel was conducting a genocide. So that's important to remember. And I think increasingly people's memories seem to be very short on these sorts of issues. But what really troubled me is that quite soon after this provisional measures order was put out by the court, it was immediately misrepresented, not just by the media, but also by very prominent lawyers and former judges of the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, who in fact wrote a letter to the Prime Minister advocating an arms embargo on the basis primarily that the International Court of Justice had found Israel either plausibly guilty of genocide, or in the context of this letter signed by these former UK Supreme Court judges, that there was a plausible risk of genocide. Neither of those things were true. One only had to read the order to understand what it is that the court was saying. And if you'll bear with me for just a moment, the court referred to what is common in this context, plausible rights. A provisional measures order is made on the basis of a very, very low threshold. It asked itself whether the case that South Africa was bringing plausibly fell within the Genocide Convention. Was it alleging plausible rights on behalf of the Palestinians? There was no assessment of the merits. There was no assessment of Israel's response. This was a very, very basic matter of essentially testing whether South Africa had a case to bring under the Genocide Convention. And the fact that this was so badly misrepresented and endorsed, that misrepresentation was endorsed by such prominent legal figures in the United Kingdom and around the world, was extraordinary to me and remains inexplicable. And I took part in a parliamentary evidence session, a bit like the congressional hearings that you have, alongside one of the signatories of that letter, Lord Jonathan Sumption, who told the committee, when I explained that the order concerned plausible risk, forgive me, that the order concerned, I've fallen into that trap there, that the order concerned plausible rights and not plausible risk, who told the committee that my position was barely arguable. But less than 30 hours later, in an unprecedented move, the former president of the International Court of Justice, who in fact drafted that order, she's the one who wrote it, she came out on Hard Talk on the BBC and vindicated every single word that I and UK Lawyers for Israel, the organisation I'm very privileged to have been involved in for some 10 years, every single word that we had been saying. She corrected the record. She said we were talking about plausible rights, and this was not an assessment on whether genocide was plausible. Even now, I see prominent individuals continuing to misrepresent that provisional measures order, despite this, unprecedented clarification by the woman who wrote that order on a very prominent BBC interview program. And so, if you're asking me about, the elements that have shocked me, That really shocked me, because it is still completely inconceivable to me why it is that otherwise, respectable leading lights on law, admittedly, they may not have much experience or any real knowledge of international law, why they would rush to put their names to something that so badly misrepresented what was very easy to discern. I think that order is only 24 pages long. The fact that they wouldn't even read it before signing on to a letter to the Prime Minister bashing Israel is even in my situation of not being surprised and having seen it all before, that was pretty shocking to me.
I think what you're highlighting is there's a certain pattern. It's a societal pattern, meaning it's the journalists, it's the legal community, it's the medical community that you read about in Australia and other places. It's pernicious. And you have what are otherwise seemingly very reputable, high standard professionals when it comes to this one issue, maybe more than this one issue, but certainly when it comes to this one issue that very much affects you and myself and many others, there is this inability of very talented, very capable, very seemingly intelligent people to call balls and strikes, an American phraseology in baseball, but to see things as
You have to explain that one to me.
see things as they are. Like just think, right? It's what I mean. It's just that is shocking, right? It's shocking when you see people that have prominent degrees and you know them to be really intelligent, just can't think coherently on a certain issue. There's just such a blind spot. That is, I'll just parenthetically, as you were sharing this, I actually thought of something. So around our gala this year in January, we were privileged to have Rabbi Daron Peretz, the head of World Mizrahi, participate in the gala. He came in from Israel. His son, as is well known, was tragically killed, murdered on October 7th, defending Kfar Aza in his tank. One of, I think, Matan Engres, who was one of the 4 members of the tank, is still alive and being held hostage in Gaza as we speak. So Rav Daron, the next morning after the gala, he and I had a conversation for a public audience in the 5 towns, an area of Long Island. And he shared, interestingly enough, that because he's a South African citizen, he shared that there are because he said sometimes there are benefits to South Africa being friends with Hamas, because he was saying as a South African citizen, he actually had some ability to communicate or to use different levers or channels in vis-a-vis the hostage issue because he was South African. I mean, it's bizarre what I'm saying, but at the same time, it's like he said himself, it's bizarre, but there are certain realities on the international playing field, and you have to use what you can use. So he's saying it's not all bad. He was saying almost facetiously, it's not all bad that South Africa is in bed with Hamas, but in the context of the international legal forums, yeah, it's pretty disconcerting when they're trying to move their agenda. It must really bother you to the degree that you're passionate about the law and you see the law being bent out of shape, distorted. Well, I think the phraseology is a certain type of lawfare that's being waged.
Right. I think lawfare is the right word, and I view lawfare as an abuse of law, of legal institutions, and in this case of international law specifically. And I think you're absolutely right to highlight that, because this weaponization of international law, it may be starting with Israel, but my goodness, it's not going to end there. It's coming after all these rule of law countries, the UK, the US included, Europe. And in fact, it reflects a battle, if you will, that has been ongoing for decades between rule of law countries that view the law as a curtailment on government power, and the despots and dictatorships of this world that in fact view law differently. They view it as a means of wielding power. And you can see this tension in the way that some international conventions have been negotiated, and the likes of Iran seeking to provide cover for their the sort of international terror proxies, and to a certain extent, that the West has a great deal to answer for, in that it has been slow to push back on these processes, both in terms of the negotiation of international conventions, and the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions is a case in point on that. But also now, there are we've talked about the ICJ, we haven't yet talked about the International criminal court, which has jurisdiction not over states but over individuals, which has also been utterly abused in this context, and has issued arrest warrants without jurisdiction and breach of its own rules and on the basis of entirely false information against former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. But the failure of member states of the ICC to call out this abuse, this lawfare, and the fact that this court is acting well outside of its own jurisdiction and in breach, not just of international law, but also international agreements like the Oslo Accords, the failure to call that out, and so far it is only the United States that has said up with this we will not put, and has instituted sanctions so far against Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the court, but has promised more. But as I say, the failure of member states of this court to hold it to account, the fact that it is a non-member state, the United States, that has been left to uphold the rule of law and keep this court accountable and criticize it acting outside of its powers is deeply, deeply troubling, specifically because it has repercussions for international law more broadly and for the rule of law in particular.
It kind of reminds me of the United Nations, to be honest. Like, I don't even know what the point of these entities are today, other than seemingly maybe there is some point. I don't know. Maybe you can educate us. Like, what really is, in some idyllic way, without all this anti-Semitism and all this chicanery, like, do these institutions actually have real purposes? I guess the UN theoretically would have such a purpose as well at some point in history, but it hasn't really been able to do that. So I'm at a loss what these institutions are really for today. I mean, I know what they're for today. I'd be like, what are they really supposed to be doing?
So all of these institutions were set up with the best of intentions and, with lofty aspirations, mostly circulating around the sort of, beauty queen answer of world peace. But they have been taken over somewhat because of the clash of interests that I described between rule of law countries and non-rule of law countries, but also in respect of Israel, because there is an inbuilt majority against Israel at the United Nations, which is not a democratic organization, where the new leader of Syria has the same vote as the whole of Germany. That there is something deeply flawed and problematic with this United Nations setup. What I would say is that I think that the one real positive that the UN affords is a forum for states to come and talk to each other. But that is probably where it should end. The notion that there should be any voting, that there should be resolutions, and therefore the need, in fact, also for the Security Council. If you take away the voting in the General Assembly, you no longer have the need for the P5 and the Security Council. If you take away any lawmaking power from the United Nations, then I think you vastly improve this institution, this organization, and you take away some of this kind of nonsense power playing about certain resolutions being put through the Security Council and one or other of the P5 vetoing it. So there is a great deal that needs to be done and investigated, and if anyone with influence is listening, then a congressional inquiry perhaps into the good and the bad of the United Nations and what must be gotten rid of and what little perhaps might be worth saving, I think would be a very useful exercise for the United States to conduct. And I think the US, is in an unusual and positive position to be able to do that, not least because of the serious amount of funding and support that it provides to the United Nations. So that would definitely be a productive exercise. But ultimately, I think that you're right. Where the UN Human Rights Council has a standing agenda item against Israel, and where this has been for so long the body that has been at the forefront of propagating these blood libels against the Jewish states, where the so-called human rights rapporteur Francesca Albanese has been at the forefront of propagating these blood libels, and where UNRWA, for goodness sake, has been infiltrated by Hamas and has ultimately been at the core of the perpetuation of this conflict since its very creation. The whole notion of Palestinian refugee status passed down generation to generation, unique to the Palestinian Arabs, that has the sole purpose of using these people as pawns in the continued attempted war of annihilation against Israel. There's no other explanation for it. No other refugee status is passed down generation to generation with the promise, as it initially was and ultimately throughout the Arab world remains, that once the Jews are pushed into the sea, these individuals, all of these generations later, will be settled in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Yafo, and that has to change. So I think you're absolutely right. A root and branch reform or even dismantling of the United Nations and of so many of these UN organizations that are responsible for perpetuating the suffering of Palestinians and Israelis alike, as well as many other groups around the world, is long overdue.
Thank you for sharing that. I have a little bit of a pivot question. It's a legal question, but it's something that you were saying kind of echoed in my mind in terms of the strategy and what's going on really descriptively. So if we can move for a second to judicial reform in Israel, right? It's and I didn't prepare well enough to know where you stand or what your opinions are on this. So you're welcome to share. But I'm curious. I mean, I did hear a little bit of an echo. It seems to me, at least based on what you were saying, there is a little echo of that tension in terms of using lawfare or the courts to take authority away from governments or sovereign states and things like that. I'm curious, maybe just, educate us a little bit in terms of at the core. It's a much longer discussion, but I guess at the core, what you see the real issues are, and if you're willing to express your thoughts on it, I would love to hear.
No, of course. Look, judicial reform in Israel is a matter that I have followed quite closely for, I'd say, over a decade. In 2016, I clerked at the Supreme Court in Israel. And so I suppose I also saw a number of the issues that have been a significant part of that public debate in Israel up close and personal. And I understood the reasons that there was a general consensus until, I'd say, the last election, that judicial reform was necessary. Ever since the so-called judicial revolution, where Aaron Barak did away with standing, arguably also, certainly lessened the criteria for justiciability, had led many to acknowledge that in this respect, the judiciary had overreached, had inserted itself into the political arena, and that carried with it frustrations, not just frustrations of the politicians, but as I understand it, frustrations of the electorate. If time and again the elected government was unable to deliver on its promises because of either judicial intervention or the threat of judicial intervention, or even more remarkably, legal advisors saying to the government, we disagree with your approach and will not endorse it. I mean, that in and of itself would be unheard of here in the United Kingdom or in the US or in any other institution. And I say that with some degree of reluctance to draw comparisons, because I think especially outside of Israel, lots of people were trying to draw comparisons between the political system in Israel, in the UK, and the US. And that is very, very difficult because the differences are hugely significant. They may be nuanced, but they are hugely significant. In the UK, we have what is often referred to as an uncodified constitution. Much of it is based on convention. In the US, of course, it is written and if I may be permitted to say, certainly from an outsider's perspective, viewed as gospel. In Israel, it is a really mixed matter, because the basic laws, which were ultimately intended piecemeal to form Israel's constitution, are only sort of part done, and that is ultimately because when Israel initially intended on having that constitution drafted, it was ultimately fighting for its existence. And so that process got pushed off and has been approached in, as I say, this piecemeal fashion. Right. So for that reason alone, drawing comparisons with other countries is extremely difficult. But what I would say is,
instead of calling it the Wild West, which we'd call it in America, we call it the Wild East. Like it's just yeah, it's not well developed. Exactly.
Right, but then of course, as in any system, you have kind of self-correction mechanisms, and you have proportional representation in Israel, which certainly makes many of us pull our hair out in terms of the political makeup of coalition governments. But ultimately, it is a check on the power of the executive. In many respects, and I think that was ultimately missed from a great deal of the discussions. But I think the last thing I would say, and we'd probably need, at least another hour to do more justice to this topic. What really troubled me before the 7th of October was how this issue had become so inverted and so badly misrepresented. What was clearly set out as an attempt to re-establish democratic accountability was inverted and presented as an attack on democracy. And the fact that that was so successful, that misrepresentation, was deeply, deeply troubling to me. And you and I both know it was tearing the Israeli political system, but also Israeli society apart. Families were turning on each other. And these weaknesses that were presented to the rest of the world were capitalized on by Israel's enemies. I hope that serves as an abiding lesson that unity is the most important facet of this. But importantly, this was always going to be the reform process, subject to debate, analysis, committee sessions, and a process of legislative reform that needed input from all parties. The moment that certain entities decide that they don't want to engage, that they don't want to be part of that legislative process, but instead they want to try, and either burn the system down or put things through in a non-democratic fashion, or whichever way people want to view this, that's when the breakdown occurs. So when reforms are meant to be debated, and the amendments that are put forward is that the pilots should be made the kings of Israel, or there should be mandatory ringtones, funny ringtones for members of Knesset, that is at the heart of the breakdown of the political and legislative process, and that's, I think, at the heart of what we witnessed, not the actual reforms themselves, which, as I say, there was general consensus on that in some shape or form they were absolutely necessary because of the situation that had developed of stagnation of so many government policies because of an overly interventionist court. What is absolutely required when this issue comes back, which inevitably it will do, is that those political divisions and the political game playing, if I can put it like that, is ultimately put aside, so that these issues can be properly thrashed out for the betterment of Israel.
I love that description. Thank you for that. That was actually excellent. As we wind down, I always like to ask my guests a few just quick kind of personal, not super personal, but just like a little bit more of a personal flavor type questions. One quick one I'll just ask. It qualifies. Do you mind just sharing kind of where were you on October 7th? How did you hear the news? What were your initial thoughts? I would just love to hear that. Curious.
It was, as I think with many people, as I woke up and saw that my phone was exploding, and deeply, unfortunately, I watched this develop on many social media groups, and I'd seen WhatsApp, Telegram, that sort of thing. So was certainly seeing a great deal that was not being shared on mainstream media, and those things will certainly never leave me. I would say that I was shocked but not surprised.
The theme today, unfortunately.
And the reason I say that is that it was perfectly evident that Israel was at war from the first moment that I was seeing what was happening. The shock was that Israel's enemies had been so successful in penetrating its defenses. Everything, the received wisdom of very sophisticated electric fence, the set up, especially around the south, to contain the terror threat from Gaza, the fact that that had been entirely overcome was deeply shocking. But the fact that I'd say the consequences of that were in no way surprising. Anyone who has followed, Arab media knows exactly what these people wanted to do to Jews. And so the consequences of that, and the slaughter and the torture and rape and mutilation and abduction of civilians was unfortunately certainly not a surprise to me. But I think, if there's anything that we take away from that, it is a renewed commitment to the security of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And that is not just through learning the lessons of the 7th of October for the security services, but it is also through making sure that Israel is able to defend herself unhindered by international discourse and misrepresentation of the situation. When I have spoken to friends of mine on the ground in Gaza, and I have asked them, how's the war going? Often the response I've had is along the lines of, not bad, considering we're fighting with both hands tied behind our back. And then I have to ask myself, why? Why are these young men and women fighting with both hands tied behind their back? And it is ultimately because of the misrepresentations in the international community, because of the inversion of international law, because of what is going on at the ICC and the ICJ, and bodies at the United Nations and on mainstream media, because that inevitably feeds into the policy formation and the decisions of, so-called allies of Israel to unjustly criticize and make false allegations that Hamas encourages and embraces. And that is why they have been fighting with both hands tied behind their back. And we'll kind of doing a bit of a full circle here, but we come back to the importance of every single one of us picking up the mantle to ensure that that is not the case going forward.
Thank you for that. If Natasha Hausdorff wasn't a barrister, she wasn't an attorney, what would she be?
That's a really difficult question to answer. I really think I found my calling as an advocate, as a barrister.
Maybe as a formulated differently. Did you ever?
I love my job. What would I do? What would I be? I perhaps in another context I might have said journalist, but considering the abject absence of journalistic integrity, I certainly would not want to enter that profession. So I'm gonna have to stick with barrister. The one downside is the wig. But I can get over the wig and gown, because really, being a barrister and also having a commitment through these professional obligations that we have to the rule of law is a deep honor and privilege.
Beautiful. Final question or two. You're relatively young, from my opinion. I think you're relatively younger than I am, if I'm not mistaken. I'm curious, just being a young advocate, kind of, have you run into kind of pushback? Has anybody ever kind of try to, I don't know, take advantage or kind of just kind of discount you because obviously you're super intelligent and super accomplished, but I imagine you may be going up against people substantially older than you.
All the time. Especially anchors that are interviewing me that don't take kindly. Look, sometimes they turn the volume down on my responses and my answers, but frankly, I think that when those clips go out on social media and it's apparent what it is that is being done, because frankly they cannot grapple with the facts as I am putting them out to you. Not just the anchor, but of course the audience, then I think people will draw their own conclusions, let me put it that way, and they do. And the response, in fact, that I have had, from around the world in relation to these interviews and debates and other contributions has been overwhelming. And I'm tremendously grateful for that support. It indicates to me that although I've never felt that I had a choice in this, it is extremely important for me to continue to do it.
What's the hardest part of kind of putting yourself out there, making these sacrifices, making these arguments on behalf of all of us who maybe aren't as equipped, what is the hardest part for you in terms of the role that you've assumed and that you're playing?
The hardest part is finding the time, because this is all,
Oh no, you got to make a living.
well, but also that's the thing. I'm in court tomorrow.
You actually deal with like regular stuff? Like, I think we didn't even talk about that. I mean, probably yes, right?
Yeah,
Corporate
absolutely.
litigation. I don't know what kind of a law you're
Absolutely. And
You're
that's
actually like a regular lawyer. Like, this is like in your spare time, this whole conversation.
it keeps me sane. I have to say, if I was doing this full time, I might, given the circumstances and everything we've discussed, I might go completely mad. But that is extremely important to me. But it does mean that time is always an issue, and I would say that ultimately that, and being kind of strategic and trying to prioritize things, but also I'm extremely conscious, David, of the fact that I don't manage to respond to everyone, and I do hope that people bear with me, and recognize that it is not through malice. I would like nothing more than to be able to engage with absolutely everyone that writes in with questions and discussions and wants me to write an essay in response, and I value those correspondences enormously. I'm just stuck for
Oh,
they're
wow.
not enough hours.
We're appreciative of your time here. And this is really the last question. One final thing, uh, something about you that most people wouldn't guess. It could be a hobby, it could be an interest, but like, people follow you, they follow your career. Something about you that most people wouldn't know about you, or wouldn't guess about you. If there's something that comes to mind that you'd be willing to share.
I can't say that I like arguing, right? That would be a bit of a giveaway. No, I don't know. I think I'm perhaps I at least try to be an open book. So I think I'm quite straightforward, and I don't know what would be something worth sharing. I used to ride horses a lot.
That's cool. Fascinating.
It's
Okay.
completely off topic, but
Oh, that's a
yeah.
fine. So, but you don't do that anymore.
Time is a bit of a factor, but if you were able to see around the room, you'd see lots of horse paintings up. So that's
Fascinating.
background.
Okay, Natasha Hausdorff, thank you so much for sharing your time, your wisdom, your erudition. I learned a tremendous amount, and I know our listeners are going to be super excited to engage with you and your content. Thank you for all that you're doing for the world, for the Jewish people, and I just want to wish you continued strength and success in all your endeavors. Your success is our success. So thank you so much.
Really appreciate that. It's been my pleasure.